the thing that the Manosphere got right is that there was kind of this like space race to see which group or like which cultural side could get to like a point of sincerity first. And I think people were really like fatigued of like political correctness, that it comes off so hollow and performative. And sadly, even though I like oppose everything they're actually saying, even I was like, this is a breath of fresh air. So I can't imagine how dangerous it is for a man who finds it not only a breath of fresh air, but they actually believe the types of things that these men are saying, right? When they then have on people like JD Vance, Trump, and these like MAGA guys, it also now offers this like cool street cred to these politicians. Even if it is real, feminists addresses all the grievances of the male loneliness epidemic. For instance, they'll say things like, you know, women have no value outside of sex. Like if a woman friend zones you, that's the worst thing she could do to you, because why on earth would you be friends with a woman? And then at the same time, they then expect women to feel sympathize with men for the male loneliness epidemic. I'm like, okay, you've just ruled out half the population as being friends for women, right? And then if I say things like, well, you know, men should go to therapy, he'll say that's gay.
Farha Khalidi, thank you very much for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
How would I describe you? How best would you describe yourself? I would say that you were a feminist.
I would say I'm a feminist. I would say I'm a content creator. I do like TikTok, YouTube. I do Onlyfans. So I call myself an e-hooker.
E-hooker?
Recently, I'm now a reality show star. So I would say I'm all those things. But e-hooker most prominently, yeah.
I love that. I've never heard that before.
I coined it.
Okay.
Yeah. To my mother's dismay.
I like that. And you've also just been on Piers Morgan's show. But the show that I want to start with, because there are so... This is like a very embarrassing confession, but I've already made it before on this podcast. So the Whatever podcast, which is this sort of like hyper-American, hyper sort of toxic masculine podcast. I think that's sort of fair to coin it like that. Essentially, there'll be a group of women who are brought in around this man called Brian, and he attempts to humiliate the women that he's brought in.
Yeah.
And my guilty pleasure is watching this podcast, much to the dismay of many people who have to listen to it with me. You were recently on it, and I thought you were excellent. Can you sort of, I think where we should start is, why did you want to enter that space? Why did you want to go into that environment?
So I actually like love the Manosphere. I love Red Pill. Like people are always like, wow, it's so ballsy of you and brave of you to go into these spaces, like to go into the lion's den. And I actually love it because my gripe with like a lot of mainstream dating conventions is that they espouse the sorts of ideas that are purported by the Red Pill, just not with their full chest, right? So for instance, I always felt like a lot of dating conventions are very gendered and asymmetrical against women. So for instance, the idea that like it's still aligning with monogamy for men to watch porn in relationships, but if a woman does porn or does OnlyFans, that's now crossing the line. That's transgressing monogamy. She's now cheating, right? But if you were to say, okay, well then I consider that cheating, they'll be like, no, it's not. Or if I were to say, you know, that's a one-sided open relationship, men are very coy about it. And they're like, no, it's not. So what I found really refreshing about the Manosphere is, you know, Fresh and Fit, like Myron Gaines and stuff, which is like the Ghetto Whatever podcast. So for instance, like he just says, open on my end, closed on yours. That's the way a relationship should be. And I found that so refreshing because I'm like, oh, thank God. Like now we can actually talk about the sorts of logic and ideas that undergird his ideology rather than just having to beat around the bush and just say like, well, no, it's different. It's not that I think that like, you know, it's worse for women to be promiscuous than men. It's not that I think that like a woman shouldn't be able to do with her body. So I'm like, okay, he just like, again, espouses like the purest form of what I saw was already the underbelly of so many mainstream dating conventions. So I loved going into those environments where these guys are just so shameless and brazen about what they have to say about women and men and those dating conventions. So that was the principal reason I went in, is I think it's fun. I think it cuts to the point and we can actually get to the underbelly without wasting time of, like guys just beating around the bush. And also, they're just not that good at it. Like, Brian hosts this show for like 20 hours a week. And when she talks about the same 3 topics, he still can't get through a sentence without stuttering, without like messing up a stat, or without hiding behind now like Andrew Wilson or something. So I'm like, oh, okay, this is going to also just be like a slam dunk. And then thirdly, obviously to promote my e-hooker career. So that's also why I go on.
So that's really interesting. So that it's an interesting, look at me stuttering now that you said that. I'm not very good at this job either. You find it easier in these spaces, in the manosphere, because there's a set parameter, because you're not dancing around what a woman should be or shouldn't be acting like in a relationship. They're just very clear that a woman should be, I mean, presuming it's sort of the Mother Mary figure, right? That a woman should be pure, a woman should be loyal, whereas a man can do whatever they want to do at any time.
Yeah, like I have more affection for them than even like the trad cons, like the traditional conservatives, because I always felt like TradCon is essentially just red pill in sheep's clothing, like people like Candace Owens, Ben Shapiro, Michael Knowles. Like they claim to be anti-male and female promiscuity. They're not. They're only ever bludgeon female promiscuity. And it's so obvious when you see people like, for instance, like Candace Owens going again, like the Fresh and Fit podcast, and she offers zero pushback to guys like Myron Gaines, who literally tell men that you should bed 50 women before getting into a relationship in order to understand female psychology. She offers no pushback to them, but then they'll co-sign onto the pushback that they push onto these sex workers. And she'll say things like, I'm just so enchanted by the hoe mind, and like slut shame these sex workers, and again offer no pushback to the man with 2 million subscribers telling his like entirely male fan base to pretty much just like jump into these promiscuous arrangements over and over. Same with like Michael Knowles. He'll go on like the whatever podcast, and the only pushback he'll ever give to someone like Brian is in like a very buddy way and say something like, bro, like you should get married, it's good for you, but it's not in the same like torture porn humiliation ritual way that he pushes on to like the female sex workers and stuff, right? So even TradCons I find so grating for that reason, because they're also beating around the bush and stuff like that. So yeah, I guess I just appreciate that they're so blunt, they're so rude, and you could just like cut straight to the point.
I wonder what you think about Charlie Kirk's wife. This is going to sound like a bit of a deviation, but one thing that has been ringing in my mind ever since that he was killed, his wife is sort of being hailed as the perfect feminist, that she has reversed feminism back to the 1950s where it should be. Do you think that's true?
That his wife is the perfect feminist?
Yes, in that she was serving her husband, that she was quietly at home, domesticated, and that's how all women should aspire to be.
Yeah, I mean, wasn't she like Miss Arizona? Like, I just don't know how strutting across the stage in a bikini is any different than what I do on like a moral basis. She has like, doesn't she have her like masters or something and stuff? And she's like very loudmouth and outspoken. And I don't say that as pejorative. I say it with admiration. So yeah, she is the perfect feminist. She's not the perfect traditional woman. She's the perfect feminist in that she's ambitious. She's the perfect example of what feminists have fought for, which is like wanting to do it all. Of like, she is a homemaker sometimes, but then she does these like, she's also in like the public domain. She's in the workforce and stuff. So I guess I would agree with that on like just a lifestyle basis, not in terms of like the garbage that comes out of her mouth, but in terms of like how she lives her life. I would say she's feminist. She lives by she's like galvanized by like feminist principles and privileged by it.
And do you think that her feminism would be accepted in the manosphere? Like if she was put onto hypothetically, to the whatever podcast and Brian was interviewing her, do you think he would accept her and her feminism?
I think he would. I mean, Candace Owens is kind of like analogous to her. And when she goes on like Fresh and Fit, again, she's a working woman. She doesn't have her college degree, but again, she's not exactly a full-time mother. And Myron Gaines, like they hype her up as like a good example of a woman, even though they go against everything that they purport of like a good woman is seen and not heard, So I think that they would. I have an affection for someone like Andrew Wilson because he's the only person who I feel like is consistent, and he just tells women to like shut up and not even be in the public space. And he'll shame even these like conservative women for being like outspoken conservative influencers. And I'm like, at least he's consistent rather than these red pillars who talk about how like they want a woman who's just like very submissive, whatever. But then again, they'll simp and glaze for a woman like Candace Owens who's very, very loudmouthed.
What do you think the knock-on effect of these podcasters or these quote unquote influencers is having on young men? Like, how do you think it's impacting, if at all, their relationship with other women?
Definitely negatively. I think that the thing that the Manosphere got right is that there was kind of this like space race to see which group or like which cultural side could get to like a point of sincerity first. And I think people were really like fatigued of like political correctness, and people even like celebrity culture in which they're like constantly making these like moral and political stances, but it comes off so hollow and performative. And sadly, these men were the first people to get to that sincerity first, the kind of sincerity that I was talking about. And even I have an affection for it, even though I like oppose everything they're actually saying. Even I was like, this is a breath of fresh air. So I can't imagine how like dangerous it is for a man who finds it not only a breath of fresh air, but they actually believe the types of things that these men are saying, right? So I would say it's negative in that way, especially towards like younger men. I just see it. Like I see guys in my DMs sometimes just send me these like essays just like of garbage where they're just practicing the talking points that they've seen on like Fresh and Fit and stuff. So it definitely is harming men. I also think it's definitely swaying people more towards political conservatism because there's that ethos with the Manosphere where they are sincere and they do come off like, they're not not just like these plasticky politicians. When they then have on people like JD Vance, Trump, and these like MAGA guys, it also now offers this like cool street cred to these politicians who otherwise would have just been categorized with those other plasticky politicians. But now because you have these cool guys like you know what I mean, you have like these, I would call them like manospheric comedians. Even like I would consider someone like Andrew Schultz, I consider him part of the manosphere, right? I consider these like broy comedians part of the manosphere. Again, like co-signing onto these politicians, it's now making them seem more down to earth to like a young male viewership.
What, making them more palatable sort of to that viewership then, sort of making them, like, inviting them in to the manosphere and essentially saying that we support them, or like giving them veracity in their claims.
Just making them seem more sincere, well, and
Right.
making them seem like they're now part of this like red pill movement. Well, the red pill in theory is supposed to be the idea that like it's above politics and that it's skeptical of politics, all of politics. It's supposed to be the idea that like both like the blue side and the red side, like Republicans and Democratic, are part of this like matrix, right? They're part of this like plasticky machine, this insincere machine. But now again, you have this red pill side co-signing onto like a lot of these conservative politicians. So they're now kind of like adopting half the political spectrum into this idea of being like more sincere and above it all, and outside of the deep state, you know.
But it's just sort of it's quite miserable, really, isn't it? Because I think so. This is, our audience is predominantly young men, young males, and a lot of the time we get emails in or we hear from people about how lonely they are. And then I look at this sort of culture and I can't help but think that it's partly responsible. I mean, do you see it like that? Do you think it is making young boys lonely?
I don't know. I have very misandrous views on the male loneliness epidemic. I think it's so overblown. I think it's so obnoxious. I think that like, I don't know, this idea that like, well, first of all, even if it is real, feminists addresses all the grievances of the male loneliness epidemic. Like, for instance, the red pill, for instance, will say things like, you know, women have no value outside of sex. Like, if a woman friend zones you, that's the worst thing she could do to you, because why on earth would you be friends with a woman? And then at the same time, they then expect women to feel sympathize with men for the male loneliness epidemic. I'm like, okay, you've just ruled out half the population as being friends for women, right? And then they do things like, I do podcasts, for instance, with this guy named Jake Shields, who always talks to me about how like men are so lonely and I'll never understand, and like, you know, men's mental health, you know, because they're not, you know, women aren't dating them, all these things, like they're being treated like shit and it's demoralizing them. And then if I say things like, well, you know, men should go to therapy, he'll say that's gay, right? So like the manosphere offers no actual tools that are like solutions for any of these male grievances, including male loneliness. But even beyond that, I just think male loneliness is so overblown because, I don't know, I think female loneliness is also equivalent. Like Generation Z is the loneliest generation alive, and yet a lot of people have just interpreted the term loneliness, like loneliness epidemic, to just mean like involuntary sex recession and just putting it onto men, when not, like when both Gen Z women and men are like retreating from the dating market and retreating from like sex lives and stuff like that. So I don't know, I think it's overblown.
Do you know, I said something really similar to what you've just said 2 years ago, and then it became like a front page story because in reaction to this, a guy said that I was unshaggable, that he would never want to have sex with me. And it just became like a front page story. I mean, when you said it back to me there, I still think that that's a reasonable thing to say.
I mean,
think
even what
that
you
young
just said,
women-
like, it shows contradiction on their part. Because on one hand, they're like, men are so lonely, no one will want to date them. But then as soon as a woman's mean to them, they're like, well, we would never want to fuck you. I'm like, so which is it? Is it that like women are the ones with these like really unattainable standards, and then they're not like, you know, is it that they're the ones who are hyper selective, or is it men now who are punishing us by not like fucking and dating us? You know, so it makes no sense.
It's interesting as well because you go on the, okay, so when you enter that podcast, there's this, you touched on it there about men in this arena perceiving things like therapy to be quote unquote gay, and another term they use is beta. And there's this point in the Whatever podcast where you're talking about domestic responsibilities. I think it was the Whatever podcast, it might have been something else. You're talking about domestic responsibilities, and you're talking about how in order to have sort of a loving and supportive relationship, then men in the home need to step up.
Yeah.
And you're told that that is beta and gay.
Oh yeah, by Michael Knowles. Yeah. So yeah, that's another great example is, for instance, like the anti-feminist movement will talk about like their holy grail of evidence for why we live in like like Brian always calls it, like we live in a gynocentric society, not a patriarchy.
That's so mad, gynocentric.
I wish he would just say like, yeah, like matriarchal. It sounds so dehumanizing to just reduce this in that like to organs, I guess, in that way. But yeah, they'll for instance talk about the fact that, like in child custody cases, it's awarded to women 80% of the time. But the reason it's awarded is because they look at the caregiving patterns, right? They look at who's doing that, like shoring up the lion's share of the housework around the house.
I think also in these spaces, it's worth mentioning that a lot of the time they are rather reductive. And a lot of the sort of the women's appearances in these spaces is based on, well, your own appearance. Like the moment that you get onto these podcasts, you're asked to rate how you think you look, how you think you're perceived. You give this like astonishing answer. I'll actually put the clip in here.
Ladies to rate their looks on a scale of 1 to 10.
1.
Well, come on. 1?
I mean, isn't this a humbleness test? Like you say something over 6 and they humble you anyway?
Yeah, but
Is that too low? 5.
The disappointment in his face there, where you say that you rate yourself as a 1. Why did you do that?
Because the whole point of why they do that segment is contradictory as well, where basically their whole idea is that it's really ludicrous for women to rate themselves as 9s and 10s because it's not accurate and women have this like inflated sense of ego, whatever. And then at the same time, if a really attractive woman on that podcast, for instance, calls herself a 10 or she like rightfully calls herself an 8 or whatever, because of that like hubris, all the comments will be like, oh, she's a 2 because of that like overconfidence, versus if a woman who's like more attractive or like median attractive calls like rates herself lower and like shows humbleness, all the comments will be like, oh, look at how like the least attractive woman in the room called herself a 10, right? So I guess my point is like they're basing it off of personality while also now purporting that like, no, attractiveness is so objective and you can't be calling yourself these things. I'm like, you guys literally just proved that you can factor personality into attractiveness, and that confidence, for instance, what you see as like unearned confidence can lower a woman's attractiveness, and what you see as humility raises one. So it makes no sense for that reason. So I was just pointing out, I was just trying to point that out, I guess. And yeah, I just thought it was funny.
Calling freelancers, small and mid-sized business owners. Tide's Instant Saver account offers up to 4% AER variable, flexible access, and competitive returns.
Unlike other options on the market, you won't need to hold your money with Tide for a fixed period. That means you'll have instant access and free withdrawals whenever you need it.
You can get started today with just £1, making it easy to start growing your business savings.
Want to know what you'll earn? Tide's clever calculator gives you a clear picture up front.
Our audience will receive £100 cash back when you deposit £5,000 within the first 30 days of opening your Tide Instant Saver account.
Use code JOE, that's J-O-E, JOE. New members receive an annual equivalent rate of up to 4% AER variable, free for 6 months. For the full offer, visit tide.co/Joe. T's and C's apply.
But men are attractive if they are confident in these spaces, right? But it's unattractive for a woman to be confident.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it is just them hoping that like if a woman has like lower confidence, like obviously they'll be more willing to sleep with them, which is obvious. But even if like
It's so depressing.
yeah,
I know that like I think that you sort of said it verbatim there, but perhaps because you're used to being in these spaces. But if you just take a step back for a moment, like that is a mad thing, isn't it? It's absolutely insane.
well, it's also just again inconsistent because then you'll have these like traditional Christians come on and they'll talk about like one of the reasons that they think people should believe in God is because it like increases well-being and happiness. And I'm like, okay, so you're saying that we should prioritize increasing well-being over something that's maybe true, but then if a woman does the same thing and she says I'm a 10, because I'm confident, it makes me feel good, then they're suddenly like, well, that doesn't matter. Like you need to know what your actual rating is, even if it like even if it harms your self-esteem, right? So it also just doesn't make sense from their like theist perspective.
If you need to know your rating. I mean, sort of like you've already touched on this slightly, but you were talking about how politicians are brought into these spaces and they're validated by the tone of the podcasters or by the messaging from the podcasters. But do you think that it's worked in tandem? Like this is sort of a broad stroke question, but do you think that these podcasters facilitated the MAGA movement, for example, or Trump being re-elected? I mean, coming from an English perspective, like just sort of explain it to people in a way that they probably don't understand.
I could say going both ways. Like one for sure, I think Trump even said that like he feels like he won the young male vote largely because of these podcasts that his son Barron Trump recommended to him, like going on things like Joe Rogan, going on things like Theo Vaughn's podcast, Andrew Schultz's podcast. So I would say with that more like that comedic side of the manosphere, I would say it definitely helped. I will say, as anti-Semitic and vile as a lot of the red pill movement is, I also think they also cast some skepticism on the MAGA movement. Like people like Nick Fuentes, Jake Shields, like a lot of them opted out of voting entirely because they said, I'm not voting for Trump because of his stance on Israel. It's not because they're pro-Palestine. It's because, they have these like really conspiratorial views of Jews as actually being like innately satanic and stuff, right? But I will say that like the silver lining of that is I was like, oh, wow, well, at least in their own perverted way, they kind of sanitized the pro-Palestine movement for their young male vile audience, right? So I think there was the silver lining of that. Obviously, the collateral is that it's anti-Semitic, but yeah, I think they did more to kind of make it cool to hate conservatives more than like a lot of liberals were able to.
Do you not get frightened going into these spaces?
No, I think it's so fun. I think it's really fun. No, I've never had a bad experience, honestly. I'm not that like the guys aren't gross, but I haven't had a bad experience because I haven't internalized anything bad from the bad experience. Because I don't know, like I said, I like when things are kind of a bloodbath. I like when I go in and they just like immediately insult me because then it gives me the green light to be able to be like a cunt back. So I find it really fun.
Do you think because of your job title as an e-hooker, do you think that they think they have more license to be rude to you?
Maybe. I will say, like, you'll see, like, usually on the whatever podcast, they'll have, like, all the liberal women on one side, and then they'll maybe have, like, one or two conservative women, like trad wives on the other side. And I will say, as much as they claim that those women are, like, the paragon of femininity and what women should aspire to, they're more keen to, like, talk over those women versus a woman like me, who's an e-hooker, but more disagreeable and, like, obviously smarter than maybe the stupid trad wives they have on. I feel like they actually show more respect towards me sometimes versus as soon as the trad wife pipes up, they immediately like speak over her or something. So I actually think like even though on paper they'll say like, we don't respect you, like no one cares what you have to say, when you actually watch the dynamic of the podcast, they're much more likely to give someone like me the spotlight over this really submissive woman who's just regurgitating their talking points because they actually find that pretty boring.
Mm-hmm. Over in the UK, there's been a movement to unionize sex workers. There was actually one successful case of doing it in Glasgow. There was a group of dancers who are now unionized under actually one of the UK's largest unions. They're official. Is that something that you would ever look into? Do you think that there should be more rights for people who work on OnlyFans?
Yeah. I mean, I think OnlyFans is such a great platform because it really is just like the safest iteration of sex work. Like you can't even get on that platform and say, for instance, that you want to meet up with someone, right? So it's just really good for that reason. And
Wait, what do you mean you can't you message each other?
yeah, but sorry, I mean like a customer and a sex worker can't meet up. So I love it for that reason because I just feel like it's just so safe, and I really do think it's like the future of sex work, and I think it's so cool that so many strippers and prostitutes and stuff have been like, leaving behind having to like work in an actual club and, having to get like, harassed and groped by these guys in person to now being able to make more and like, protect themselves and stuff.
There's always a lot of talk, and I think you sort of semi-experienced this when you went on Piers Morgan's show last week. You sort of like held as a paragon or held as like you're asked questions like, what if other young girls end up doing this career? I mean, how do you answer that? Is it really your responsibility to speak for other young girls?
I think it is. I think it is my responsibility as an influencer. Same way I think these male podcasters who spew vile stuff, I would hold them accountable. So what I was trying to say on the podcast is that like I'm not a choice feminist. I do think like just because you make a choice, it doesn't make it a feminist choice, right? And I think a good example I like to give is, for instance, in these red pill spaces, they'll, for instance, promote like a one-sided open relationship. Like I was saying, the idea that like a guy should be able to have multiple partners, but a girl should be loyal to her boyfriend and not even have a public Instagram account because they see that as an act of infidelity, right? If a woman chose to do that, right? If she chose to not have an Instagram account, just be very quiet and allow her boyfriend to have multiple girlfriends, yes, like she's acting with an autonomy. That doesn't make it a feminist choice, right? I wouldn't tell her she's not allowed to do it. I wouldn't try to criminalize what she's doing, but I don't think just because she's making that choice that means it's not the product of brainwashing or that she's not promoting something that's like egregious towards women, right? So like I do think what I do does matter, and I think that like my main thing is like I don't think whether you're getting naked in a relationship or online that delineation is that the delineation there is like one's respectful and one's not. One's good for women, one's not. I think you do have to look at, for instance, like the types of content. Like I think whether you're on OnlyFans or in a private bedroom, if you're doing like violent sexual acts, you're doing sexual acts that harm you and stuff like that, I do think that affects women, and it's, you know, in a way like selling out your gender and stuff. So
What taking part in violent sexual acts?
yeah, like I think there could be good porn and I think there could be bad porn, you know? So I think that like if you're a sex worker and you're like, for instance, fetishizing like a lack of consent, I would say that's more harmful for women than just the fact that you're doing sex work in general, right? So I'm always like eager to like add that nuance that like I don't think necessarily.
It's a huge category though, isn't it? Fetishizing a lack of consent. It's
Yeah,
such a huge category online.
it is, yeah. Yeah, so I think that's kind of
Concerning.
dangerous, yeah.
Yeah.
And what I always think is like I think that porn has caused so much harm, and in a weird way that I used to be very, very vehemently anti-porn, but I think seeing how much damage porn has caused has weirdly made me pro-porn, because I guess I've realized that like if porn can be a vehicle for like guys emulating really like nasty behaviors that they see on the hub and then like pitching and proposing it and pressuring their female partners into undertaking it with them, I think implicit in that argument is the idea that like, okay, well then guys can emulate good behaviors they see on the hub, right? And for me, it's like, why would we leave a void of representation for the subject matter that pertains to things like infidelity, STD, sexual coercion, rape, unwanted pregnancy, right? If anything, I would think that this subject matter warrants like the utmost representation, the utmost like good modeling of behaviors that we want young boys to be seeing, rather than like leaving them to their own devices and learning from like their loser friends or from like the locker room how to like hook up with women, right? So I think for me, I've become kind of pro porn, not because I'm a fan of the content that's currently on the hub, but because I think it could be used as a vehicle. And rather than seeing it as a negative, it's like this is a genre that has like garners more clicks than like Netflix and TikTok combined, and it's a genre that has like literally like possesses like 80% of global men's like attention spans, right? So rather than just like throwing the baby with the bathwater, why not just use it to promote, again, like healthy sexual behaviors, correct against sexual coercion, correct against like fetishizing infidelity, lack of consent, and all those things.
But do you think that would people click on those?
I think they would. I really do think like sexual desire is so malleable. I really do think that like people develop kinks as a result of like what they're seeing online. Like I do think they would, yeah. I'm not saying it has to be like super sterile and like, you know, you're signing some sort of like consent contract in the videos as foreplay, but I think there's definitely a middle ground.
I just sort of want to talk about the politics in America a bit more broadly. Do you think that it's become a more aggressive place in the States under the Trump administration since the Biden administration departed?
I think for sure, like even when you see the way that like Trump responded to like the assassination of Charlie Kirk, and when he was at the memorial and he said things like, I think after Erica Kirk said like, you know, I don't hate my enemies, and then his response was to say like, well, unlike her, I actually do hate my enemies, right? I think that's kind of a weird thing to say, because I think the implication there is that your enemy is now like what, 50% of the country that you're supposed to govern over, and then you have everyone like cheering as if it's like a sports team fight, you know? So I think he's definitely made a more like hostile, like coarse political culture for sure.
Do you think that Kamala Harris would have been any different? Do you think that do you think she would have been able to keep the lid on some of the very anti-women rhetoric or narrative that we see coming out of the States?
I think so, even if just as a result that she's more politically correct and more careful, which I think is partly what made people more skeptical of her. Like I remember, for instance, when she was running against like Joe Biden, and someone asked her in an interview, they're like, "Well, you very vehemently opposed like Joe Biden, but now you're his VP." And then she would just like laugh and say like, "Well, it was a debate. Like obviously I'm going to oppose him." And then people were like really skeptical of that. They're like, "Oh, so you're just like you're part of this like kind of like deep state matrix where you're just like going through the motions and being performative." But again, I think the silver lining of that like performativeness is I don't think she would have said something like, you know, I hate half the country, you know, so I think it would have kept a lid in that way.
Do you think she could have won it if she'd gone on Joe Rogan's podcast a bit more frequently?
I honestly think it could have helped. I don't know if going on like, I think the only press she did was like she went on like Call Her Daddy
She did.
podcast. What?
Yes, she did.
Yeah, and I don't know if that was like the best move, because I feel like she already kind of would have won like the young, like pro, like female sexually promiscuous vote anyway. So I don't really know what what the point of that was.
It became so much, it definitely seemed from where we were sitting, the debate just before the election became so hyper-focused on trans people and on LGBT. Do you think that, I mean, why do you think that it became so fervent, so inflamed around trans and LGBT just before the election? Or did it feel that way when you were in the States?
Oh, I don't know. I don't know if it like peaked right before the election. Feel like people have been talking about trans people for the past like 5 years in America for like a while now. I think part of it's like a strategy on part of conservatives. Like I've even heard Ben Shapiro say during like a student union that he was speaking at. Someone asked him. They said, "How do I convince my more like centrist friends to lean towards our side of the political aisle?" And Ben Shapiro said, "You got to like hook them on a visceral issue, like something like feminism or trans issues, because even if they're centrist, they probably have a gut reaction, like a visceral instinct in opposition to maybe like the trans issue." So he's like, once you like hook them there, then you can kind of like bring them more into like your side, that political aisle. And I thought that was so telling of like how they use this issue to kind of hook people, because a lot of conservatives, they don't have an actual like economic platform. They don't have actual like good economic ideas or even necessarily even good social ideals. So they pick this one thing that applies to like a very, very small minority of people in order to bring over people who are more centrist. And then a lot of liberals kind of take the bait and then like play the game. And I think liberals don't need to like talk about trans people that much, in my opinion.
Do you think that would be helpful if liberals just stopped speaking about it?
I think they concede too much ground. Like they do too much like relativism about like gender and stuff and talk about how like gender doesn't exist at all. And, I think it just isn't convincing. And I think you could still be pro-trans. You could still be I'm okay with a trans woman using the woman's bathroom, but I don't think you need to completely like erode the definition of a woman, because that's unsettling to feminists. That's unsettling to like most like the average person's like intuition and stuff. So I think you could still be both. You don't have to like again throw away the baby with the bathwater and just completely disintegrate the definition of a woman, or just feel like there's no reason for women's spaces, or like they play dumb a lot. Like for instance, if like a trans person competes in women's Jeopardy and people oppose it, like the liberal impulse is to say like, oh, so are you saying that like you think women are genetically inferior to men intellectually because you think that like a biologically male brain is better suited? And I think that's so disingenuous, because by that logic, why have affirmative action? Why have spaces for different races and for women in these carved out spaces, right? I think it's just playing dumb to a lot of other liberal sensibilities of why we have these spaces carved out for minorities. And it just comes off to me, someone who is like pro-trans but still pro-feminist, as just being like very unconvincing. And it's, in my opinion, just gonna be an impetus for people who are still in the middle and undecided to just lean more conservative.
That's actually really interesting. I hadn't thought about that before. So you think being reactionary can be harmful to both movements?
I think it's reactionary. I think it's more so like playing dumb. And again, it just like completely doesn't adhere to the other like logical like the other, I don't know, just the other forms of logic that we use for, again, of like, we're so intellectually nuanced on like the liberal side for why we justify things like affirmative action, why we justify things like DEI and stuff. And we talk about things like reparations. We talk about the idea of like, no, it's not racist. It's not looking down on Black people to have specific spaces or like give them a leg up, right? But then again, we suddenly throw all that like intellectual nuance on the trans topic and now, do what conservatives do pretty much. And we just, again, parrot their argument when they're opposing things like affirmative action. And they say, oh, so you think Black people are dumb, or you think they like need a leg up? But now we do that when it comes to responding to like critiques of trans people.
Mm-hmm. I just want to ask you sort of finally, is it helpful or is it a hindrance being political or speaking out while also doing the career that you've chosen?
I think it's helped, and that's kind of the irony of it is, for instance, when I was on Piers Morgan, Esther was like, your opportunities are only going to erode as you do sex work. And it's funny because I actually think that like it's giving me like a foot in the door where people are more eager to like kind of pick your brain as like a sex worker. And I think it also kind of makes me like a dark horse in some ways, where people don't really expect much of like a woman, let alone like a sex worker in the space. So it kind of just gives me, I don't know, I think it gives me a privilege.
You are, like, you can tell you are fiercely intelligent when you're in those debates or in those spaces. You can hear it. And it's awful because it sounds pejorative to the other women who are present. But it is, I mean, I suppose it is rather refreshing. Okay, where can people find you online?
They can find me on onlyfans.com/Farha Khalidi, tiktok.com/Farha Khalidi. Just Farha Khalidi on all platforms.
Amazing. Thank you for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks to Tide and their instant savings account for sponsoring this week's podcast.
New members receive an annual equivalent rate of up to 4% AER variable.
Our audience will receive £100 cash back when you deposit £5,000 within the first 30 days of opening your Tide Instant Saver account.
Use code JOE. For the full offer, visit tide.co/Joe. T's and C's apply.